So the first thing I had to do was to go and find suitably depressing pictures to juxtapose what our Earth is today with what it could look like in 30 or 40 years. And we're going to talk about the environmental impact of anesthesia and try and make it, gives you some sedation perspectives on that. The good news is that as sedation practitioners, you're really looking after the Earth better than those of us who might do more general anesthesia, although I'm very much a dedicated total intravenous anesthesia enthusiast. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, is it a problem? We're hearing about climate change and global warming all the time. And as clinicians and anesthetists, we are part of this problem. And you're often getting faced with people saying, but are we really part of the problem? What's our contribution? Why don't they start with big industry, big other companies? But I think we have to acknowledge, and we'll go through some of the stats, that we can actually admit that we are part of this problem. We need to be taking some steps to reduce our impact. Is everybody connected to the Wi-Fi? I hope so. Okay. So we're going to just ask the audience a question, please. If I can ask you all to go to slido.com as a website and to put in this number when it asks you 2624371. And we're going to do a little poll. Just two answers. We are part of the problem. I want my practice to change, or start with the bigger industries and leave me alone. And we'll get a live, real-time voting. We're expecting 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 20. Okay, maybe about 30 people. Is anyone typing or chosen an answer yet? We're waiting for you. I've seen one. It is anonymous. Okay, looks like we've got 7.
Is this a safe space?
It is a very safe space. 14, 15, 20. Okay. Oh, wow. Let me just see who that one person is. No, it's completely anonymous. Fantastic. Oh, there's 2 of you now. Oh, yeah, really? 25. My answer is definitely A. Okay, good. So hopefully we all then admit that there is a problem. We need to be part of it. We've got to be conscious of it. So what is the problem? Well, if you look at the data from the NHS, anesthetic gases, including nitrous, contribute about 2.5% of their healthcare industry's carbon dioxide emissions. And if you look specifically just in the acute hospital setting, so where people are doing theatre, emergency care, it's about 5%. So it's not insignificant. And this is before we factor in things like plastic waste, drug costs, and associated life cycle assessments. And if you look at the US data from 2013, the healthcare sector contributes about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's not an insignificant number. And something to just put it in perspective, you can see that it says if the healthcare sector were a country, it would be the 5th largest polluter on Earth. Okay, so together we are really, this is a big problem. And just very simply, what are we worried about? We're worried about the Earth's energy budget. We're worried about all this warming and all this incoming solar radiation. Some of it's reflected by the clouds, some of it's reflected by the surface, some's absorbed by the surface. The oceans play a big part in absorbing a lot of this radiative energy. And we want, most of it to leave, or at least an equal amount to leave, so that there's either a net energy balance or zero. And what's happening is all the greenhouse gases here are causing back radiation and getting involved in the atmosphere and the ozone, and not allowing this heat and all these other generated radiative forces to actually escape. And that's what's causing the Earth's, the surface to heat up. So is it actually a problem? Well, the World Health Organization estimates that climate-related mortality is about 0.3% of all annual deaths. That's 150,000 people a year that are dying just from climate-related issues. And what are we talking about? We're saying climate change is affecting crop production. It's impacting, therefore, nutrition. Infectious diseases are related to the availability of clean water, and respiratory diseases are related to our pollution levels. So it very much is an issue. What about if we say, it's such a small part, well, I'm doing a little bit of gas here and there. Well, this was a really interesting study where they actually went to measure modern inhalational agents, and they went to look where they could find them, and they looked at a few different sites. You'll see here, hopefully you can see it says the North Pacific, it says Antarctica, and it says Jungfrau Joch. Does anyone know where Jungfraujoch is? Do you? Switzerland. Yeah, okay. In fact, and what you really can see here is that if you go up, you can just see that these agents are all just increasing, okay? Halothane's probably come down because we're not using it as much, but desflurane is going up, sevoflurane is going up as well. And it's been detected not in massive numbers, but we are finding that it's there. What I thought was really nice is this is Jungfraujoch. Looks pretty.
It's the north face, it's a bit of a mission climb.
I won't be climbing, but if the world does sort of flood and fires and ends or something, I will be there. Okay, so I'll be putting on my lederhosen and drinking lots of beer, and I think that's not a bad way to go in Jungfraujoch. So until it does end, let's just have a brief look at what are we actually worried about. So there are differences between all these drugs. Nitrous oxide, atmospheric lifetime of 114 years. Okay, we could have a very good debate about is there a place for nitrous oxide at all in our practice? Maybe in the labor ward, maybe for sedation, but using canisters, and we'll go into why. Halothane, not so bad. Enflurane, 4 years. Isoflurane, 3.2. Desflurane, 14. And sevoflurane, 1 year. And that's really why desflurane is getting such a bad rap at the moment, and probably rightly so. And then you've got, so as well as sitting in the atmosphere and causing downward radiation of the heat, there's also whether or not they actually have ozone depleting potential as well. And you can see clearly that nitrous does as well. And it's only until you get to desflurane and sevoflurane, they are actually do not deplete the ozone, but still cause the rise in temperature. So that should give you some food for thought when thinking about what should you be using. And certainly in my hospital, I'm trying to get the people to understand I'd like to take all the desflurane vaporizers out and put them in the matron's office. If you want it, it's available, but you need to have a good reason for wanting to use it, I think. So if we break it down further to things like global warming potential, sevoflurane's metabolized 5%, 250 mils gives you 44 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. Isoflurane, less metabolism, about 190 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. And this is, really again highlighting desflurane, global warming potential of 2,500, not metabolized, and 240 mils a bottle, almost a ton of CO2 equivalents. And people now on Twitter, I'm friends with a guy, well, friends is a strong word, we know each other on Twitter. What are Twitter friends called? Twits, I don't know, we twits or something. So he's calculated his own individual carbon footprint. He estimates that his footprint is 9 tons annually. 9 tons, and he's a devoted intravenous anesthesia practitioner. And imagine using 1 bottle of DES for your cases, you'd get through that in a week using 1 ton of CO2. So we've got to think about these things. Nitrous oxide, global warming potential, not bad, not really metabolized. A 3.4 kilogram cylinder, though, about over 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. And this is really what we need to realize. Global warming potential, 0. Extensively metabolized, but it just doesn't release anything into the atmosphere. There are obviously other things to discuss in terms of the life cycle assessments and the usage of and the manufacturer. But it still comes out the best. We'll hopefully convince you. What can you get? You can get little calculators like these from the Association of Anesthetists, and you can actually plug in your values. You can tell it how long you've gone for, what concentration of gas you're using, whether you're using a bit of SEVO for an inhalation induction, a little bit of light sedation, and it'll actually tell you in pounds what your cost per hour is, and then the distance per hour, that equivalent distance as if you had been driving a car. And these are quite sort of fun things to go through and see what your impact is. And this is a life cycle done by Sherman et al. In 2012. And it's very clear again here that when they're looking at just gas emissions, okay, obviously the red part is including nitrous oxide as well. Those were the emissions that you see with desflurane, with isoflurane, with sevoflurane, obviously propofol. There are no waste anesthetic gas emissions. And then even if you go into a full life cycle, so they're looking at agent manufacturing of nitrous, packaging, transport, drug delivery, and then waste management as well. So incineration of drugs, propofol clearly trumps all of these, okay? And it needs to give a lot of food for thought as to what drugs and what sort of anesthetics we should be subjecting our patients to. I had to put some of these in because everybody puts in a car equivalent of using DES and where you would land up. So I think this was done by the American guys driving from San Francisco. If you used 1 Mach hour of common anesthetic drugs and the CO2 equivalent, sevoflurane only gets you to, I think, South San Francisco. Isoflurane gets you to Half Moon Bay. Nitrous oxide, you get as far as, what is that, Monterey? I think so, okay. Desflurane, you get all the way down to Los Angeles. Okay, so it is bad, but we need to nuance this and just bring in a few other issues as well to actually decide what are we going to be doing. But a lot of places are already going green, and you'll see this in the NHS, again, talking about how much CO2 production. The average drive commute is 15 kilometers. Stopping 1 bottle of desflurane a day is the same as 200 staff driving electric cars to work. So it is quite a large impact, and I don't really see how the Baxter people are going to convince us to use desflurane again, just because it's easy, I think, and it's evident in the fact that they've actually stopped marketing. We got a letter recently to say that the reps won't be coming around anymore to actually try and convince us that this is environmentally sound and their bottles are recycled and they're going to use capture technology. The capture technology is expensive. It's not going to be large-scale implementable solution. And what have we seen happening overseas? The European Commission, there is already legislation tabled that they want to ban the use of desflurane in 2026, and there is talk of sevoflurane as well. I think that's a much more difficult argument to be had. I think it's, with desflurane, it's probably an easy argument to make, but I think sevoflurane we're going to still need to have available in our practice. And they're putting out information pamphlets that in a drive for greener surgery, and they've managed to drop from using 20% of all the anesthetic gases used to about 3%, and they're already estimating they've saved almost 61,000 tons of carbon emissions a year, and that's equivalent to taking 29,000 cars off the roads. I mean, quite staggering. So to think we're not really part of the problem, what impact can we have? I mean, we can really make quite a big impact. So what about nitrous? I just want to highlight here that what do these articles speak about? There's a massive wastage of nitrous oxide, especially in our old aging infrastructure. And what do they show? They went and did a sort of assessment study. They found leaking valves and broken manifolds and rusted pipes. And they're estimating they're losing hundreds and thousands of liters of nitrous oxide a year. We're probably losing more than we are using. So what do they want to suggest? Things like, this writing's a bit small, but they want to have multidisciplinary gas committees, see if we actually need nitrous. Let's replace pipe nitrous with cylinders. Review the stock, identification of leaks. I can't remember if I've shown this before, but have you ever seen a picture of this old cough syrup? So I love the fact that it says that's why our grandparents say they used to walk to school in snow. I mean, have you seen the cannabis, chloroform, morphine, hydrochloride? I mean, that's a cough syrup. What's the one that's just been taken? That's been taken off the market now with the Volcadine? Yeah, okay, maybe we should bring back this one. So this is just to highlight, when we're thinking about all of these things, we actually have to think about several steps. We can't just think about where we are in our use. We have to know what happens with raw material extraction, what about the pre-consumer scrap that's generated, the fuel cycle, the energy that's used, what sort of energy it is, whether it's solar, coal, gas, nuclear, the use of it. Is anything used to reuse and remanufacture, end-of-life recycling, and then post-consumer scrap? And recycling requires, it's not just a simple process, it requires energy expenditure as well. Can I just get a time? Can you tell me where we are, just so I know? Okay. So, we want to know about, in production, what are the raw materials, what energy is expended to produce, what waste is done, what are the sorts of emissions to air, water, and soil, and the same for when we use it, and the same for disposable. So where does this lead us to? There are very nice studies done, and this was in 2012, life cycle assessments of disposable textiles, so the scrubs we wear, to reusable laryngeal masks, to sets for venous catheter insertion, not the whole set, but just what you use to put it in, and single and disposable laryngoscopes. In America, almost everything is disposable, single-use, tourniquets, laryngoscopes, and reusable stuff almost always trumps single-use. And maybe we need to give some thought towards going back to reusable laryngeal mask airways. Then the first thing people say is, oh, but prion disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob, it's a concern. And would you like it? I would put it to you that a lot of us spent 5 years as registrars putting reusable LMAs into thousands of patients. It wasn't a concern. I don't think it should be a concern in private now. And there is no documented case of transmission from a laryngeal mask of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So, you know, we were having that argument at my local hospital, and then I shared this as well as them just to keep them quiet, which was the extent of lymphocyte contamination on the laryngoscope blades as well. And then I said, but you know, you tube the patients with your laryngoscope, which you give to your sister after you finish, and she cleans it with a cloth, and then it goes in that little bucket or something, and that is supposedly high-level sterilization. I mean, it's, you know, it's a pro and con debate. There are lots of risks with everything we do. So just some nice things that also show the cost in US dollars of desflurane, Sevo, isoflurane at different gas flows. And obviously, we know that we should be aiming to do low-flow anesthesia. The more you go up, the more your inhalational agent cost is going to increase, the more your CO2 absorbent cost is going to increase. And if you look at total cost, almost always desflurane here is costing the most. It's got the highest CO2 impact. The CO2 absorbent is going down because obviously as you increase your flows, you use the CO2 canisters less. Isoflurane actually doesn't look too bad, but remember that it's got some ozone depleting potential. So one thing that they've also noticed or commenting on is that compound A doesn't seem to be a problem anymore with the newer CO2 absorbers. So we can actually try and look to go towards basal flows. And obviously inherently with that is issues about your inspired oxygen concentration, so it will require, you know, attention to monitoring, but we really should be trying to reduce our flows to the lowest level possible. These were guys in Australia who were just looking at costing of intravenous anesthesia versus volatiles and what it costs, and they were making the point that it does actually depend on what our propofol costs, where, you know, which country we're in. It's astounding that in some places propofol is still quite expensive, and most of the developing world still doesn't have access to propofol, you know. So these are things that probably need to change, but what they did show was, again, looking at different durations of anesthetics, and they've looked at the cost for remifentanil, the total TIVA costs, and then comparing it to volatiles, and the costs with sevoflurane are actually quite similar. I think what we do need to bear in mind is that remifentanil does actually quite dramatically increase the cost of TIVA, and TIVA doesn't have to be always propofol, remifentanil. We've heard about a lot of other agents that are suitable. So maybe that needs to guide whether or not we're using remifentanil all the time. And desflurane, you know, they were using quite high doses of propofol here as well, but still, desflurane, very expensive. So certainly a good argument that TIVA is not more expensive. And I just put this in for people to see what the costs are actually. If you look at the commonest one we're using, a 20 ml amp, you're looking at 24 Rand for an amp. So propofol and generic propofol has actually really become quite affordable. Another study which was really interesting was they looked at cradle-to-gate greenhouse gas emissions for 20 common anesthetic drugs. And what they found was that the sort of environmental impact correlates with the number of steps needed to actually manufacture these drugs. The more steps they had, the more greenhouse gas emissions they would have. They looked at, if we can just show over here, lignocaine, ropivacaine, propofol, remifentanil, dexmedetomidine, ketamine, midazolam, all the drugs that we'd actually like to have information about. They went into the different processes. This was a very boring article, so I just skipped to the sort of, what did they find, because I didn't need to know about filtration and drying and solvent recovery and distillation, and then they even had a diagram of how this all went, which was all very cute. So, but they did a very well-designed study and took as much information as they had about the processes, but some companies didn't give information because they felt it was proprietary how they produce their drugs. And what did they see, and what should we be bearing in mind? Propofol, actually looking quite good at the top there. Lignocaine, also quite good. There's fentanyl, there's remifentanil, ketamine, a little bit more greenhouse gas emissions, and we're getting into things like midazolam, morphine, not great. And interestingly enough, dexmedetomidine doesn't seem to look too great now when we look at it from that point of view. So again, it's just a lot of food for thought about what we need to, how we're going to decide what drugs to use. People also now very quick to say, but what about waste pollution with propofol? It's going into the water, it's killing our fish. But I would put it to you, there isn't any perfect drug. And if you actually look at the studies, there are studies that look at the impact of erythromycin, clarithromycin, ibuprofen, diclofenac, ethanol, estradiol, metformin, propranolol. These have the highest ecotoxicological risk to surface water environment. And they have estimated that even a worst-case propofol wastewater exposure, the estimates fall well below the threshold at which aquatic species are going to sustain adverse effects. So probably we are still safe. It's safe by using propofol. It's an area that does need more research. But let's just remember that propofol should be discarded for incineration. It should not be squirted into the basin. Okay, and anyone who's doing that, you need to stop. It needs to go into incineration, it needs to be burnt, and the life cycle assessments of propofol already say that they've taken that into account even when they say it's more environmentally friendly, the burning and the incineration. So no more squirting down the drains, no more squirting into the sharp. Well, the sharp spin will get incinerated. We could accept that. But generally, red bag for incineration. There's a very nice article to read. This one still gets me, I like it. There's a very nice article to read, and I'm not going to spend too much time so that we can get through everything, about intravenous anesthesia and propofol and all the benefits of propofol. And I think they apply to sedation as well. Very hard to make an argument for volatile reduction in post-operative nausea and vomiting, beneficial effects on the immune system. There's, some studies suggesting improved survival rate in surgical cancer cases. Older patients may be able, may reduce post-operative cognitive dysfunction. So again, something to consider. And do any other intravenous agents offer these benefits as well? Maybe it's a discussion we need to have. So this was the study where they looked global warming potential, propofol. They did include remifentanil, the plastic production, the glass production, waste incineration. They even looked at how much electricity you would use to power your pumps. Okay? And there's the sort of cost in electricity for a 7-hour anesthetic, the amount of CO2 that's being released for a TIVA total versus a desflurane and a sevoflurane anesthetic. And that's quite substantially less. So everything pointing in terms of that, using intravenous anesthesia. I think it would be unreasonable not to highlight that probably the best way to deliver any intravenous agent is through target-controlled infusion. And what you're going to find is that you're going to get targeting the actual effect site, you're going to reduce the amount of drug that you use, you're going to avoid drug calculation errors, you're going to avoid overshoot. We just cannot do as good a job manually as we can with a TCI pump. Some of the other things, it is really simpler. You're just aiming for a single digit. It compensates for infusion interruptions. It's automatically adjusting, bearing in mind the pharmacokinetics and the context-sensitive half times, and you should then get greater hemodynamic stability as well. Don't forget that we have monitors that will help us as well. So we've mentioned EEG by luck, that this will again help you titrate and reduce the amount of drugs that you are using. And what should be coming hopefully soon are our nociception monitors. So this is the Knoll monitor, which gives you an idea of the parasympathetic-sympathetic balance. And these are the kinds of things that we'll use to titrate analgesia. There's a lot of resistance to them, but we are notoriously bad at assessing the depth of our patients sometimes. We're certainly bad at assessing whether our patients have been well analgesed. We wake them up, we think we've done a good job, and maybe they're painful later. So any monitor that may aid us in improving the care of our patients, I think we should be using. People also say, but what about the surgeons? I'm afraid this is one area we cannot blame the surgeons. So we'll just keep it in this room, if you don't mind, that anesthetic gases and with nitrous constitute almost about 40% of that surgical intervention. So this is looking just at surgery greenhouse gas emissions, and that's including patient travel, how long the patient spent in hospital, the surgical procedures, all of their equipment, and yet we're still 20% and probably room for improvement. To finish off, just some things to ponder, because it's not as simple as, well, just use that drug and you've done a good job. How do we get to work? How do our patients get to work? Okay, can we get to work by an electric vehicle? Or is that also a bad thing because there's child labor to produce lithium batteries? And it's not an easy answer. What sort of electricity are we using? If we can use solar, that's awesome. But a lot of it's coal, nuclear. Warming our patients, can we consider using the resistive warming devices like the hot dog warming blankets? How many of our theaters are still running and changing air cycles? It doesn't reduce. The air con's on, the lights are left on the whole night, the taps haven't been checked. There's so much potential to reduce the impact that we have. And then thinking about which are the drugs that we can choose, all obviously, primarily for the safety and for best outcomes for our patients, but as well as for the environment. And then we know that operating theaters produce about 2,300 kilograms of plastic waste a year. Are we recycling? How many of us are recycling? Okay, shame on you.